Chapter 1. Introduction, Historical Context of the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula, located between China in the north and Japan in the east, has been a place of strategic importance for thousands of years. Its geographical location made it a hub of political, cultural, and economic interactions between the great powers of East Asia. At the same time, independent political structures and cultural traditions developed on the peninsula, which shaped Korea into an independent cultural space. Korea's history is marked by dynasties, invasions, cultural exchanges, and national identity, all of which played a role when division and war became inevitable in the 20th century. Since the first millennium BC, a complex network of kingdoms has emerged on the peninsula, fighting for territory, influence, and cultural supremacy. In particular, the Three Kingdoms system, Goguryeo in the north, Baekje in the southwest, and Silla in the southeast shaped the political structure of Korea for centuries. The unification by the Kingdom of Silla in the 7th century and later the Goryeo dynasty created stable administrative structures, legal systems, and cultural centers that form the foundation for Korea's identity. This long history reveals a central aspect, the constant balance between autonomy and the influence of foreign powers, especially China and Japan. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these influences intensified drastically. Korea came under increasing pressure from imperialism, especially from Japan, which saw the peninsula as a strategic springboard for its expansion. The annexation of Korea by Japan in 1910 ended centuries-old independence and ushered in a period of colonial rule, oppression, and cultural assimilation. Japan implemented schools, administration, and economy according to its own interests and tried to suppress Korean culture and language. At the same time, resistance took various forms, from political movements to armed resistance. These years created deep-rooted political tensions and nationalist consciousness, which was to become crucial after the end of World War II. World War II brought the liberation of Korea from Japanese rule, but not political unity. The peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel after Japan's surrender in 1945, with the Soviet Union occupying the north and the United States occupying the south. This division, initially intended as a temporary solution, laid the foundation for the ideological and political division that would culminate in open war a few years later. The history of the Korean Peninsula up to the 20th century shows how geographical location, historical conquests, and foreign influences created a complex foundation for the coming conflict. Korea's political, cultural, and social landscape was thus shaped by centuries of autonomy, foreign rule, and national consolidation. These backgrounds are essential to understand why the Korean Peninsula got into an ideological, military, and geopolitical conflict after 1945, which was to make history as the Korean War. The long line of dynasties, invasions, and resistance inevitably led to a field of tension in which national identity, ideological convictions, and international interests collided. Chapter 2. Korea Before the War, Colonial History and National Divisions. The period before the outbreak of the Korean War was decisively marked by colonial rule, social change, and political fragmentation. The Japanese occupation of Korea from 1910 to 1945 left deep scars that went far beyond direct political control. Japanese rulers relied on a comprehensive assimilation policy. The Korean language was severely restricted in schools. Korean cultural practices were suppressed, and a system of economic exploitation was established, often plunging the local population into poverty. At the same time, modern infrastructures such as railways, industrial plants, and administrative systems were expanded, but primarily to promote the interests of the Japanese Empire. This dual reality, progress under duress, had a lasting impact on Korean society. During the colonial period, intense resistance to Japanese rule developed. National movements such as the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea, founded in Shanghai in 1919, strove for independence. The March Uprising of 1919, Sawmill Movement, is considered a milestone of the Korean resistance. Hundreds of thousands of Koreans protested against the colonial power, demanded self-determination, and were brutally suppressed. This early 20th century laid the foundation for a politically conscious society that was divided into different directions after the liberation of Japan in 1945. With the end of World War II and the surrender of Japan, Korea faced the challenge of establishing an independent national order. But the Allies had divided the peninsula along ideological lines. The North, under Soviet occupation, embraced socialism, while the South developed a free market democracy under U.S. influence. The political landscape was now characterized by ideological antagonisms, rivalries between parties, and regional tensions. Parties and groups that had previously fought against the Japanese occupation suddenly found themselves in a complex power game between communism, capitalism, and nationalism. This phase was also marked by social tensions and economic inequality. Land reform in the North led to expropriation and collectivization, while in the South, much of the land remained in the hands of traditional elites. Urbanization, the return of workers from Japan, and the lack of resources exacerbated social conflicts. In addition, international influence meant that local political decisions were often determined by external powers, weakening the sense of national self-determination. Korean society was thus divided before the war began, between North and South, between communism and democracy, between old elites and new political movements. These divisions at the political, social, and economic levels formed the breeding ground for the conflict that culminated in open war in 1950. The North saw itself as the vanguard of a socialist revolution, the South strove for independence and Western-oriented democracy. On both sides, the population was deeply anchored in the structures of the colonial era and at the same time shaped by ideological mobilization and propaganda. In summary, Korea was not neutral ground before the war. The experiences of the colonial era, the political tensions, and the social differences made the peninsula a powder keg. The division was not only a geopolitical act, but reflected decades of conflict, grievances, and historical trauma. Understanding this prehistory is crucial to understanding the causes, dynamics, and tragedies of the Korean War. Chapter 3. Post-War Order in East Asia, the Consequences of World War II. The Second World War fundamentally changed the political map of East Asia. Japan, which had been aggressively expanding for decades, was militarily defeated, and its colonial rule in Korea, Taiwan, and parts of China ended. The defeat left a power vacuum that directly influenced Korea's political future. At the same time, the Allies began to rearrange the region, with ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union already laying the groundwork for the Cold War global confrontation. Korea was no exception at this stage. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the peninsula was initially placed under provisional administration. The 38th parallel was established as the provisional occupation line. The Soviet Union took control of the North, the USA the South. This decision was originally pragmatic, to coordinate the Japanese surrender and maintain order on the peninsula. But it had far-reaching consequences, as the occupying powers began to establish political structures that were oriented towards their ideological interests. In the North, the Soviets introduced strict communist control. They supported the founding of the Korean Labor Party, organized land reforms, and strengthened the power of party officials who followed Soviet ideas. The aim was to transform the peninsula into a socialist planned economy and one-party political rule. At the same time, opponents of the regime were persecuted, traditional elites were disempowered, and propaganda was used to swear the population to socialist ideology. In the South, on the other hand, the United States promoted democratic structures, which, however, were strongly tied to Western ideas of a market economy and parliamentary democracy. The U.S. initially installed military governments, supported conservative politicians and economic elites, and tried to weaken left-wing movements. The economic situation was tense. Hunger, infrastructure destruction, and social unrest dominated everyday life, while at the same time, political parties and movements struggled for influence. The American occupation aimed to establish a stable, Western-oriented republic that would serve as a bulwark against communism. This post-war order clearly showed that Korea was a geopolitical area of tension from the beginning. The division was not a natural, cultural, or historical necessity, but the result of international power politics. At the same time, an ideological split began to manifest itself. The North saw itself as a revolutionary model, the South as a free democracy, with both sides becoming increasingly militarized and politicized. The population, which had just left Japanese colonial rule behind, was once again drawn into a field of conflict between larger powers. The international dimension of this area of tension should not be underestimated. Both the United States and the Soviet Union viewed Korea as a strategically important area for their respective interests in East Asia. Every decision, every support for political actors, every intervention in economic issues contributed to the peninsula becoming a theater of the Cold War. The consequence was that national attempts at self-determination were often hindered or controlled by international interests, creating the conditions for a future war. In summary, the post-war order in East Asia put Korea in a precarious position between ideology, geopolitics, and national self-determination. The decisions from 1945 to 1950 laid the foundation for the later escalation. The partition of Korea, the creation of ideological systems in the North and South, and international interference created a political minefield that would explode in 1950 in one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. Chapter 4. The Partition of Korea, 38th Parallel and Political Structures. The division of Korea along the 38th parallel was initially intended as a provisional measure to organize control of the peninsula after the end of Japanese colonial rule. But this seemingly pragmatic decision turned out to be a permanent split that laid the foundation for the Korean War. The 38th parallel divided the peninsula almost exactly into a northern and southern sector, but the political, economic, and social developments in both zones soon developed in opposite directions. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was formed under Soviet influence. The Soviet Union supported the establishment of a centralized system in which the Korean Labor Party and Kim Il-sung as the leader consolidated power. Land reforms, expropriations of large landowners, and the collectivization of agriculture and industry were implemented to entrench the ideology of socialism. These changes were not only political in nature, but also affected the daily lives of the population. Social hierarchies were abolished, political loyalty was enforced, and opposition was often brutally suppressed. Under American influence, the South developed into a Western-oriented Republic of Korea, in which military governments initially dominated the political system. The United States supported conservative elites and economic actors, while left-wing groups and communists were persecuted or marginalized. The economic situation was difficult. Infrastructural damage from the colonial era, unemployment, and social inequality shaped people's lives. At the same time, political parties, trade unions, and civil society organizations emerged that tried to build democratic structures but were often suppressed or controlled by the government. Under American influence, the South developed into a Western-oriented Republic of Korea, in which military governments initially dominated the political system. The United States supported conservative elites and economic actors, while left-wing groups and communists were persecuted or marginalized. The economic situation was difficult. Infrastructural damage from the colonial era, unemployment, and social inequality shaped people's lives. At the same time, political parties, trade unions, and civil society organizations emerged that tried to build democratic structures but were often suppressed or controlled by the government. The ideological divide between North and South widened rapidly. While the North relied on collectivization, a planned economy, and the creation of a socialist state, the South oriented itself towards capitalist principles, private enterprise, and individual freedom. Both systems claimed to represent legitimate Korea, which further exacerbated the political situation. The population was increasingly divided into two camps, those who supported the Nordic vision of a socialist Korea and those who preferred South Korean democracy. The international dimension played a decisive role in this. The U.S. and the Soviet Union viewed Korea as a chessboard in the Cold War. Every decision, every political support, every military measure was taken on the premise of strengthening one's own ideology and weakening the other side. The 38th parallel became not only a geographical dividing line, but also a symbol of the global confrontation between East and West. The division had profound social consequences. Families were separated, trade and communication between North and South were interrupted, and the population lived under constant suspicion and insecurity. Propaganda, political cleansing, and ideological education shaped both sides. The population became increasingly militarized and politicized, so that the conditions were created for a later escalation into open war. To sum up, the division of Korea was not only the result of geopolitical interests, but also deepened the social, economic, and ideological divisions of the population. The 38th parallel marked the border of two states that developed different political systems, social structures, and national visions. This separation laid the foundation for the tensions that would explode in the Korean War in 1950 and made the Korean Peninsula one of the central theaters of the Cold War. Chapter 5: Rise of the Parties to the Conflict, North Korea and South Korea. After the division of Korea along the 38th parallel, two opposing political systems developed, each trying to consolidate its power and swear the population to its ideology. In the North, Kim Il-sung took over the leadership of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, supported by the Soviet Union. Kim, a former guerrilla fighter against the Japanese occupation, had designed the political structure to centralize his position and impose communist ideology in all areas. Under his leadership, land reforms were carried out that expropriated large landowners and supported landless peasants, while political opponents were eliminated or sent to labor camps. Education, media, and culture were instrumentalized to generate loyalty to the party and the leader, and the state created strict surveillance of the population, which made deviations from the line almost impossible. In the South, the Republic of Korea was created under the presidency of Syngman Rhee under U.S. influence. Rhee, a nationalist-oriented politician, was vehemently anti-communist and strove to consolidate the Southern administration independently of the North. The U.S. military government supported him in weakening political opponents, controlling trade unions, and ensuring economic stability. Society in the South was characterized by insecurity, poverty, and political competition, but also by a certain degree of pluralism which was evident in parties, civil society movements, and a free press, even if these freedoms were often restricted when they endangered government policies. Both sides increasingly developed their self-image as the legitimate representative of Korea, which deepened the division ideologically. The North claimed the entire peninsula for a socialist revolution, while the South promoted democracy and capitalist order as the only legitimate model. This mutual irreconcilability was further exacerbated by propaganda, schooling, and political purges. Children grew up in systems that portrayed the other model as illegitimate and dangerous, manifesting the social divide across generations. The international dimension greatly strengthened this process. The Soviet Union provided the North with political advisors, military instructors, and weapons to ensure the stability and enforcement of communist rule. The U.S. supported the South through military presence, economic aid, and political advice to strengthen democracy and prevent the spread of communism. This support made inter-Korean conflicts part of the global Cold War, in which Korea acted as a proxy for the superpowers. During these years, there were already clashes near the border, espionage, and acts of sabotage, which showed how tense the situation was. Both sides were preparing for possible military conflicts. The North built military structures, trained soldiers, and planned strategic offensives, while the South focused on defense, paramilitary organizations, and border security. The population was involved in this process, whether through military training, forced labor, or ideological training. In summary, the years between 1945 and 1950 were decisive in shaping the parties to the conflict politically, militarily, and ideologically. Kim Il-sung in the North and Syngman Rhee in the South established power structures that were highly centralized and geared towards loyalty to the respective ideology. This development laid the foundation for the impending Korean War. The two states were separated not only by the 38th parallel, but also by a deep ideological and social divide that made any compromise almost impossible. Chapter 6: International Tensions and the Role of the UN. Tensions on the Korean Peninsula were not limited to the two Koreas, but reflected the global conflicts of the beginning of the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union viewed Korea as a strategically important area, directly bordering China and Japan in the U.S. occupation zone. Every decision on the peninsula was thus viewed in an international power game, in which ideology, security policy, and geopolitical interests were intertwined. In the North, the Soviet Union strengthened the military and administrative infrastructure and supported Kim Il-sung in modernizing the Korean People's Army. Advisors, arms deliveries, and training helped to develop the North into an effective power apparatus ready to unite the entire peninsula under socialist rule. Kim Il-sung himself developed a plan for the conquest of South Korea, based on rapid, coordinated offensives and the use of local communist sympathizers. In the South, on the other hand, the United States secured Syngman Rhee's political backing, military training, and economic aid. U.S. troops remained stationed in South Korea after the Japanese surrender to ensure government stabilization and contain communist influence. At the same time, the U.S. supported the formation of a South Korean army that would serve as the core of defense against the North. These preparations clearly showed that both superpowers viewed Korea as a geopolitical playing field on which the ideological tensions of the Cold War manifested themselves. The founding of the United Nations in 1945 provided an international platform on which the Korean question was increasingly discussed. Initially, the UN played a mediating role, pushing for free elections to be held throughout the peninsula to restore national unity. But tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union prevented the UN from gaining effective control over the entire electoral process. While elections were held in the South under UN observation that confirmed Syngman Rhee as president, the North refused to cooperate, leaving the peninsula de facto divided into two states. The international dimension was also evident in China's role. Although the People's Republic of China was not founded until 1949, it observed developments in Korea with growing concern. A united communist Korea would have direct influence on China's northern border, while a South Korean, Western-oriented state could affect China's security. These geopolitical considerations later led China to intervene militarily after the outbreak of war to influence the balance on the peninsula. Tensions escalated increasingly in 1949 and 1950. Border conflicts, defections, acts of sabotage, and propaganda exacerbated the mistrust between North and South. Each side viewed the 38th parallel not only as a geographical border, but as a symbol of political legitimacy to defend or overcome. International actors were ready to support both sides, increasing the local conflict into a proxy war between East and West. To sum up, Korea's international dimension was crucial to understanding the escalation. The UN tried to mediate as a neutral entity, but was unable to overcome the fundamental ideological and geopolitical conflicts. The superpowers and China viewed the peninsula strategically, investing resources in military and political preparation, thus creating the conditions for the Korean War, which would soon seem inevitable. Chapter 7. The Road to War: Provocations, Armament, and Strategic Plans. In the years immediately preceding the Korean War, tensions between North and South Korea escalated dramatically. The political division along the 38th parallel had long since ceased to be just an administrative problem, but had developed into a highly explosive field of conflict. Both sides strategically prepared for the possibility of open war, and at the same time carried out targeted provocations to test the weaknesses of the other side. In the North, Kim Il-sung began to massively upgrade his army in 1949. The Korean People's Army was modernized, military training was intensified, new weapons were imported from the Soviet Union, and offensive strategies were developed based on lightning strikes and coordinated use of infantry, artillery, and armored units. At the same time, the North carried out propaganda campaigns in the border regions, sent reconnaissance troops to the South, and tried to mobilize local communist networks. Each provocation served the dual purpose: to gain military experience and to destabilize the South. In the South, Syngman Rhee reacted with a mixture of defensive rearmament and political pressure. The South Korean Army, supported by U.S. military advisors, received modern weapons and training, but resources were limited, and many units were not yet ready to fight. At the same time, the South Korean government tried to prepare the population for the defense case through political purges, border patrols, and high-profile propaganda. The constant threat from the North led to growing fear and insecurity among the civilian population. The provocations took different forms. Border crossings, shots fired at patrols, acts of sabotage on infrastructure, and espionage operations were part of everyday life along the 38th parallel. Each side interpreted even small incidents as a sign of the aggressive intention of the opponent, which led to a steady increase in mistrust and escalation dynamics. Historical sources show that the number of border incidents increased rapidly in the months leading up to the war, and the military commanders of both sides recognized the seriousness of the situation. International factors further exacerbated tensions. The U.S. emphasized its commitment to the defense of South Korea and at the same time signaled that a communist attack would not be tolerated. The Soviet Union encouraged North Korea to pursue the goal of reunification under communist rule, providing both military equipment and strategic advice. China watched the developments with growing concern, even before the People's Liberation Army was directly involved. The peninsula thus became a focal point of international rivalries, with local conflicts quickly taking on global dimensions. Kim Il-sung made the plan in 1950 to take over the South militarily. He was convinced that a rapid offensive was possible before the U.S. and the UN could intervene effectively. The plans included the mobilization of troops, the coordination of attacks along the border regions, and the use of surprise effects. North Korea was preparing to decide the war within a few weeks by overrunning the South Korean army. In summary, it can be seen that the years before the war were characterized by a combination of provocations, rearmament, and strategic planning. Both sides acted defensively and offensively at the same time, with every movement marked by mistrust, ideological toughness, and international calculation. These preparations, coupled with ideological irreconcilability and support from superpowers, made the outbreak of war in June 1950 almost inevitable. The stage was set for a conflict that would not only shake the Korean Peninsula, but also have a lasting impact on international Cold War politics. Chapter 8. The Outbreak of the Korean War, June 1950. In the early morning of June 25, 1950, the Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel in a coordinated attack, triggering the Korean War. North Korean troops, supported by Soviet training and equipment, simultaneously launched several offensives along the entire borderline. The attacks were well planned, focused on strategic targets such as bridges, communication centers, and military hubs, and used the element of surprise to overwhelm the South Korean units. South Korea was only partially prepared for an attack of this magnitude. Many units were poorly equipped, the military command was sometimes ineffective, and the communication systems were vulnerable. Within hours, the North invaded the South Korean border region, destroying infrastructure and decimating the defense lines. The capital Seoul, strategically and symbolically of enormous importance, was on the verge of being threatened by North Korean troops. The international reaction was prompt. The United Nations condemned the attack as aggression and passed resolutions calling for support for South Korea. Under U.S. leadership, troops were mobilized to provide military support to South Korea. The U.S. saw the war not only as a regional crisis, but as a Cold War battlefront, the outcome of which could affect the global balance between East and West. North Korea continued its strategy of rapid offensive, crossing strategically important rivers and roads and cutting off South Korea from supply lines. The South Korean troops withdrew chaotically, which further weakened the defenses. Despite fierce resistance, North Korea managed to penetrate deep into South Korean territory within a few days, highlighting the drama of the situation. The population of South Korea was severely affected by the rapid escalation. Civilians fled the fighting en masse, and the humanitarian crisis quickly worsened. Towns and villages were destroyed, supply systems collapsed, and infrastructure severely damaged. The fighting was not only military conflicts, but also social and humanitarian catastrophes that had a lasting impact on the country. North Korea's leadership was convinced that the war could be decided within a few weeks, but the rapid international response of the UN and the US showed that rapid unification under communist rule was not so easy to achieve. The war evolved from a local border conflict to an international confrontation in which strategic decisions were influenced not only by the states involved, but also by global powers. In summary, June 25, 1950 marks the official beginning of the Korean War, the extent and consequences of which reached far beyond the Korean Peninsula. North Korea's surprise attack, the initial overwhelm of South Korea, and the immediate international response set in motion a chain of events that would lead to 6 years of intense conflict, geopolitical tensions, and human suffering.
Chapter 9. The Fall of Seoul and the First Setbacks for South Korea. Only 3 days after the North Korean invasion, on June 28, 1950, Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell into the hands of North Korean troops. This early success was not only a military victory, but also a psychological blow to the South Korean government and people. The North Korean offensive had smashed the South Korean defenses. Many soldiers had fled in panic or were captured, and the city's civilian structures collapsed. The capture of Seoul demonstrated the effectiveness of North Korea's blitzkrieg strategy, rapid movements, coordinated attacks on key positions, and the use of artillery and tanks to overwhelm resistance points. The South Korean troops, some of whom were poorly trained and inadequately equipped, could hardly withstand this. Numerous soldiers had to concentrate on the South in chaotic retreat movements, which made it even more difficult to organize defense. The civilian casualties were immense. The capture of the city led to mass flights, houses were destroyed, food shortages and lack of medical care exacerbated the humanitarian crisis. Families were torn apart, and the fear of reprisals by North Korean troops shaped the population. Historical accounts show that many residents were caught between the fronts, giving the war an early social dimension that went far beyond military operations. South Korea's political leaders reacted to the loss of the capital with a mixture of shock and strategic retreat. President Syngman Rhee moved his government to Busan in the south in order to maintain control of the country and secure the possibility of organized defense. At the same time, international help was urgently needed. The UN and the US mobilized troops and logistical support to stop the advance of the North Korean army. While Seoul fell, the North Korean troops extended their offensive further south. Towns and villages along the main transport routes were conquered, supply lines were cut, and communication networks were destroyed. The speed of the advance overwhelmed the South Korean forces and led to significant losses of personnel and material. Historians refer to this phase as a critical turning point in which the South was almost completely overrun by North Korean control. The international observers recognized that South Korea's situation was critical. North Korea's rapid expansion made it clear that without direct military intervention by the UN and the United States, a complete collapse of the South Korean state was imminent. This dramatic start to the war showed how much military superiority, surprise effects, and strategic planning can influence the outcome of conflicts. In summary, the fall of Seoul marks one of the most dramatic moments of the first days of the war. The North Korean offensive had initially made South Korea almost unable to act, plunged the population into fear and chaos, and made clear the urgency of international intervention. The war was now in full swing, and the coming weeks would decide the further course and survival of South Korea.
Chapter 10. The International Intervention, UN and U.S. Troops Arrive. The rapid advance of North Korean troops in June 1950 alarmed the international community. Within days of Seoul's fall, the United Nations Security Council called for urgent military support for South Korea. This intervention was historic, as it was one of the first military actions of the UN in an international conflict and sent a clear signal to the communist states: aggression against a sovereign state would not go unpunished. The United States, under the leadership of President Harry S. Truman, took a central role in this military support. U.S. troops originally stationed in Japan were immediately transferred to South Korea. These units consisted of battle-experienced soldiers who still came from the Second World War and had modern weapons, artillery, and tanks. Their initial goal was to stabilize South Korea's defenses, slow down the North Korean offensive, and protect the population from further attacks. The UN opted for a multinational force that included British, Canadian, Turkish, and other units. This international participation gave the intervention not only military strength but also political legitimacy. South Korea thus became a global focal point of the Cold War, in which local conflicts were directly embedded in world politics. The presence of UN troops also signaled that the Western world was ready to take collective security measures against the spread of communism. The first UN troops arrived in South Korea at the end of July 1950, but the situation on the ground remained critical. North Korean troops had already controlled large parts of the country, and the South Korean army was severely decimated. The UN troops first had to build defensive lines, secure strategic cities, and coordinate the evacuation of civilians. The logistical challenge was enormous, as supply routes were repeatedly interrupted by destroyed infrastructure and continuous attacks. A central strategic focus of the UN and U.S. troops was the defense of the southern port city of Busan, which was considered the last unoccupied bastion of South Korea. Busan became a symbolic and practical retreat for the South Korean government and military forces. There, defenses were erected, troops were consolidated, and supply lines were established by sea. Historians refer to this period as the Busan perimeter phase, which was crucial in preventing South Korea from collapsing completely. At the same time, airstrikes were carried out on North Korean positions to slow down the advance and disrupt supply routes. The American Air Force played a crucial role as it monitored the movements of North Korean troops and carried out targeted strikes on bridges, roads, and depots. This was demonstrated for the first time by modern warfare, in which air and ground troops acted in close coordination to weaken the enemy. A central strategic focus of the UN and U.S. troops was the defense of the southern port city of Busan, which was considered the last unoccupied bastion of South Korea. Busan became a symbolic and practical retreat for the South Korean government and military forces.
There, defenses were erected, troops were consolidated, and supply lines were established by sea. Historians refer to this period as the Busan perimeter phase, which was crucial in preventing South Korea from collapsing completely. At the same time, airstrikes were carried out on North Korean positions to slow down the advance and disrupt supply routes. The American Air Force played a crucial role as it monitored the movements of North Korean troops and carried out targeted strikes on bridges, roads, and depots. This was demonstrated for the first time by modern warfare, in which air and ground troops acted in close coordination to weaken the enemy. The international intervention had not only military but also psychological effects. It boosted the morale of the South Korean people and soldiers who had previously been demoralized by the quick North Korean victories. At the same time, it signaled to North Korea that the conflict had now taken on a global dimension and that further expansion into South Korea would face considerable resistance. In summary, the arrival of UN and US troops marks a turning point in the early course of the Korean War. The International stabilized the South, prevented the complete collapse of South Korea, and set the stage for counteroffensives that would decisively shape the war in the months that followed.
Chapter 11. The Busan Perimeter, Defense and First Counteroffensive. After the rapid advance of North Korean troops, the South Korean army was on the verge of collapse. The last major bastion in the south of the country was the port city of Busan, which was crucial as a strategic and logistical hub. In the second half of 1950, the defensive operations around Busan formed the so-called Busan Perimeter, which was to mark the first turning point in the war. Defending the Busan Perimeter was an enormous challenge. The North Korean army, motivated by the quick successes so far, did everything in its power to break through the South Korean lines. On the side of the UN in South Korea were around 140,000 soldiers, including South Korean troops, American units, and other international units. The troops had to build improvised defenses, dig trenches, secure artillery posts, and protect the population, all while waiting for supplies and reinforcements. The North Korean attacks were intense and coordinated. Infantry, tanks, and artillery were systematically used to overcome the perimeter lines. Every capture of small villages and hills turned into a bloody battle, with losses on both sides. Despite the numerical inferiority, the UN and South Korean troops managed to repel the attacks, partly through the targeted use of air support and artillery. Historians describe this phase as a martial art of the defensive, in which tactics, knowledge of the terrain, and international support were the decisive factors. During the defense phase, it became clear that the Busan perimeter was crucial not only militarily but also psychologically. For the South Korean government and people, the defense symbolized the continued existence of the state. For North Korea, the perimeter was an obstacle that stalled its rapid offensive. The battles for Busan were therefore not only a military duel, but also a race for morale that was to have a decisive influence on the coming months. The arrival of reinforcements from the United States and other UN states marked the beginning of planning for a counteroffensive. General Douglas MacArthur, commander-in-chief of the UN troops, developed a strategy based on a surprise flank attack. His plan was aimed at tying North Korean troops along the front line, while an amphibious landing behind enemy lines would carry the offensive to the center of the North Korean army. This operation was intended to bring the initiative back into the hands of UN troops. The preparation of this counteroffensive required precise logistics, intensive coordination between land, sea, and air forces, as well as secrecy so as not to draw the attention of the North Koreans to the impending operation. The landing in Incheon, a heavily fortified port north of Seoul, was chosen as a key operation to break through the front line and initiate the recapture of the capital. In summary, the Busan perimeter shows that even in a seemingly hopeless situation, coordinated defense, international support, and tactical sophistication can decisively influence the course of a war. The successes in defense formed the basis for the UN's first large-scale counteroffensive, which was to change the course of the war permanently. Chapter 12. The Incheon Landing.
Turning point and recapture of Seoul. The Incheon Landing on September 15, 1950, is considered one of the decisive turning points of the Korean War. General Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the UN forces, planned the operation with extreme precision and the aim of surprising the North Korean forces behind the front line. The landing at Incheon, a port far north of Busan, was intended to cut off North Korea's supply lines, recapture the capital Seoul, and finally bring the initiative in the war to the side of the UN troops. The operation was logistically extremely complex. Incheon was characterized by tides, difficult currents, and heavily fortified coastal positions, making the landing a risky endeavor. Nevertheless, the troops relied on surprise and speed. Amphibious landings, supported by naval and air forces, allowed UN troops to land at several points at once and quickly gain a foothold. The North Korean army was surprised. It had concentrated its forces along the front and did not expect a major offensive from the north. The landing of UN troops behind their lines caused chaos as supplies and communications were disrupted. Numerous North Korean units panicked or were surrounded, which completely shifted the military initiative to the side of the UN troops. Within days of landing, the recapture of Seoul began. UN and South Korean troops advanced rapidly, while airstrikes hampered the movements of North Korean troops. The fighting in and around Seoul was intense, as North Korean troops put up stubborn resistance. Nevertheless, the UN forces managed to recapture the city on September 28, 1950, only 3 months after its fall. The reconquest of Seoul had not only military but also psychological effects. For South Korea, this was a symbol of hope and survival. The population was able to experience relative safety for the first time in months. For North Korea, the defeat meant a significant loss of material, strategic position, and moral superiority. The operation also demonstrated the importance of modern warfare. Coordination of land, sea, and air forces, the use of surprise effects, and precise planning could create decisive advantages even in a seemingly hopeless scenario. MacArthur's plan is still considered a masterpiece of military strategy today, as it completely surprised North Korean troops and put UN troops on the offensive. The Incheon landing ushered in a phase of intense counteroffensives. UN and South Korean troops used the initiative to drive North Korea out of large parts of the Southern Territory and move the front line further north. This opened up the possibility of bringing the Korean Peninsula completely under South Korean control, a goal that would soon be complicated by new geopolitical factors. In summary, the Incheon landing marks the strategic turning point of the war, in which the initiative passed from North Korea to the UN troops. It showed that through precise planning, surprise, and international cooperation, even a seemingly overwhelming opponent can be overcome. The recapture of Seoul symbolized not only military success, but also the hope of stability and peace in a war-torn country. Chapter 13. The Pursuit of North Korean Troops to the Yalu River. After the successful Incheon landing and the recapture of Seoul, the UN and South Korean troops used the strategic initiative to push the North Korean army further north. The counteroffensive quickly developed into a pursuit operation, pushing back North Korean troops from almost all southern areas. UN forces pursued the weakened North Korean units as they advanced along the west and east coasts, regaining control of key cities and transport routes. The military situation of the North Korean army deteriorated dramatically. Many of their troops were exhausted by the rapid retreats, supplies were scarce, and morale dropped significantly. The UN troops used modern weapons, air superiority, and coordinated supplies to continuously maintain their offensive. North Korean units were forced to retreat to desperate lines of defense, while civilians in the combat zones once again suffered massive strain. The UN offensive eventually led the troops to the Chinese border on the Yalu River, the natural border river between North Korea and China. At the beginning of October 1950, the UN troops were in the immediate vicinity of the Yalu, giving the impression that the complete defeat of North Korea was imminent. This rapid forward movement impressed the international community, but it also showed the limits of military expansion. The geographical and political factors, especially the proximity of China, could not be ignored. China's leadership under Mao Zedong watched the events with growing concern. The possibility of U.S.-led troops being stationed directly on the Chinese border led to massive political and military consultations. China saw the threat not only as a potential attack on its own security, but also as U.S. influence on the Korean Peninsula and strategic control of Northeast Asia. As a result, China made the decision to actively intervene in the war to protect North Korea from final defeat. The UN troops thus encountered a new geopolitical factor, the threat of Chinese intervention. The strategic situation deteriorated as UN troops now had to fend off not only an exhausted North Korean army, but also a massive Chinese contingent. This development highlighted the complexity of the war. Local military successes could be quickly neutralized by international intervention, and every military decision had far-reaching political consequences. The pursuit of North Korean troops to the Yalu River demonstrated how modern warfare, logistical strength, and coordination can enable great tactical successes. At the same time, it showed the limits of such successes as soon as geopolitical realities came into play. The Korean conflict was now evolving from a localized war to an international proxy war that directly reflected the tensions of the Cold War on Korean soil. In summary, the advance movement to the Yalu marks both the culmination of the UN offensive and the beginning of a new phase in which Chinese troops would decisively change the dynamics of the war. The fate of North Korea was now inextricably linked to the geopolitical interests of China and the United States, giving the conflict a new, more dangerous dimension.
Chapter 14: The Chinese Intervention, Massive Counteroffensive and Withdrawal of UN Troops. The rapid UN offensive to the Yalu River had almost completely smashed the North Korean resistance. But the geopolitical situation changed dramatically when the Chinese People's Liberation Army, PLA, intervened in the conflict in October 1950. China viewed the presence of American and UN troops on its border as a direct threat and decided to launch a massive counterstrike to protect North Korea and stop the advance of UN troops. The Chinese intervention was well organized and surprising. The PLA deployed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, most of whom were experienced troops who had fought in China's Civil War and during World War II. The soldiers used camouflage, terrain knowledge, and nocturnal movements to take the UN troops by surprise. Despite the UN's numerical superiority in weapons, air support, and artillery, the Chinese units managed to launch decisive surprise attacks which put a considerable strain on the morale of the UN troops. The first Chinese offensives hit the UN troops in November 1950, when they had overstretched their supply lines and were on a long advance to North Korea. The soldiers were exhausted, supplies were difficult, and the extreme winter conditions made the fight even more difficult. The PLA consistently exploited this weakness and carried out targeted attacks that forced UN troops to retreat. Some of the weakened North Korean remnants joined Chinese troops or were reactively mobilized to support the counteroffensive. The UN troops, led by General MacArthur, were forced to conduct a strategic retreat operation. Troops retreated south in chaotic battles, with many cities, including Seoul, again at risk. The initial arrogance that North Korea could be defeated quickly gave way to a sobering reality. The war had turned into a protracted stalemate, with front lines shaking sharply and losses remaining high. The Chinese intervention fundamentally changed the dynamics of the war. It showed that local military successes cannot be considered in isolation when international powers are involved. The UN troops were now forced to fight not only against North Korean units, but also against a massive, well-coordinated Chinese force that was superior both in numbers and strategically. The fighting during the Chinese counteroffensive was brutal. Temperatures below freezing, difficult terrain, and constant ambushes led to enormous physical and psychological stress for the soldiers. Many units of the UN troops were surrounded, supply routes destroyed, and communications interrupted.
Historians refer to this phase as one of the most critical and costly periods of the Korean War. The return of the front lines to the south, especially the renewed threat to Seoul, highlighted the volatility of the conflict. The Chinese intervention made it clear that the war would not be localized and that long-term stability could only be achieved through political solutions. At the same time, she demonstrated the importance of flexibility, adaptability, and coordination in modern warfare. In summary, the Chinese intervention marks the phase in which the Korean War went from a seemingly decided conflict to a protracted, balanced proxy war. The withdrawal operation of the UN troops, the initial successes of North Korea, and the massive Chinese attacks showed that the war had now entered a period of extreme insecurity and fierce fighting that was to mark the coming years.
Chapter 15. The Stabilization of the Front Lines, Standoff and Trench Warfare. After the massive Chinese counteroffensive in the winter of 1950-1951, the front lines gradually stabilized after UN troops and South Korean units consolidated their losses and established new defensive positions. The initial offensive, which almost wiped out the North Korean army, had stalled due to the Chinese intervention. Now began a phase that historians call stalemate or trench warfare, a period in which major territorial gains became rare and the fighting extremely grueling. The front line ran roughly along the 38th parallel, which had served as the political border between North and South Korea even before the war. Both sides built massive defenses, trenches, minefields, and fortified positions to repel enemy movements. Artillery, machine guns, and air support were used intensively, but direct territorial gains were only possible to a limited extent. Minor tactical successes were quickly neutralized by counterattacks or geographical obstacles. This phase of the war was marked by high human costs. Soldiers on both sides suffered from extreme climatic conditions, lack of supplies, and permanent threat of artillery attacks. Battles were often localized but fierce and led to enormous losses without strategically decisive changes being achieved. Historians often compared this period of the war with trench warfare in World War I, as progress was minimal, casualties high, and front lines almost unchanging. Politically, the stalemate led to increasing frustration on both sides. In the U.S., public criticism of the conduct of the war increased, while the South Korean population suffered from the destructive effects of the ongoing conflict. North Korea and China had to spend enormous resources to supply their troops, while logistical challenges for UN troops remained. Diplomatic efforts to end the war became increasingly important, as complete victory did not seem realistic for either side. Despite the stalemate, smaller offensives and counteroffensives continued. Both the UN and the Sino-North Korean troops carried out selective attacks to control strategic heights, transport routes, or cities. These struggles, often referred to as limited offensives, led to local territorial gains, but could not permanently change the overarching status quo. The stabilization of the front lines also had psychological effects. Soldiers had to learn to survive for months in an almost static, dangerous environment. Combat experiences, loss of comrades, and permanent insecurity led to extreme psychological pressure. At the same time, there was a growing awareness that the war would no longer be decided by rapid movements, but by long-term endurance, logistical efficiency, and tactical precision. In summary, this phase marks the transition of the Korean War from a mobile, decision-oriented offensive to a grueling trench warfare. Both sides were now trapped in a conflict in which tactical successes were limited, but human suffering increased exponentially. The coming years were to be marked by the stalemate, while political negotiations and diplomatic efforts tried in parallel to find a solution that could put an end to years of bloodshed.
Chapter 16. Air Warfare and Artillery, technology and modern warfare in trench warfare. During the stalemate of the Korean War, the technological dimension of the war became increasingly important. Front lines were deadlocked, territorial gains were limited, but the use of air force and artillery allowed both sides to exert strategic pressure, weaken the enemy's morale, and strengthen their own influence on the battlefield. The UN Air Force, especially the U.S. Air Force, used its technological superiority to support ground troops, destroy enemy supply routes, and bomb military infrastructure. Aircraft such as the F-86 Sabre and the B-29 bombers dominated the skies and enabled air superiority, which often gave ground operations the decisive advantage. Airstrikes were used not only against military targets, but also against logistical hubs and bridges to obstruct the movements of North Korean and Chinese troops. The Sino-North Korean armed forces were forced to respond to this superiority. They used tactical movements at night, hidden troop movements, and improvised bunkers and shelters to minimize losses from airstrikes. Ingenuity and adaptability became decisive factors, as direct confrontations in open sections of the terrain meant devastating losses. In addition to the Air Force, artillery played a central role. Both sides used heavy artillery, mortars, and rockets to bomb enemy lines. Artillery attacks were often preemptive and demoralizing, as they hit military targets as well as positions, supply depots, and residential areas. Especially in the winter and spring of 1951, artillery became crucial as movement operations were limited and static lines had to be defended. The integration of air and artillery operations required precise coordination and communication. Modern technologies such as radios, radar, and aerial reconnaissance were used intensively to identify enemy positions and enable precise hits. This phase of the war demonstrated for the first time in the history of conflict on a larger scale how technological superiority and coordinated firepower could make the difference even in a seemingly deadlocked trench war. However, the air war also brought enormous civilian losses. Bombings destroyed cities, villages, and infrastructure, dramatically worsening the humanitarian situation in Korea. Civilians were under constant threat, and reconstruction after destruction was difficult. The combination of technological advancement and static front lines led to a new form of modern war, in which technological dominance was directly linked to human suffering. The developments in air warfare and the artillery phase also showed the limits of modern warfare. Despite technological superiority, tactical territorial gains could not be achieved permanently as long as the opponent had adaptability, mass, and motivation. The static front lines forced both sides to think not only about military striking power, but also about logistics, morale, and diplomatic strategies. In summary, the air war and the use of modern artillery decisively shaped the stalemate phase of the Korean War. Technology enabled targeted pressure, increased the vulnerability of the opponent, and demonstrated the development of modern warfare. At the same time, the limitation of these means became apparent when mobility, terrain, and human factors played an equally decisive role in the conflict. Chapter 17. Diplomatic Efforts and Armistice Negotiations, the Road to the End of the War. During the stalemate phase of the Korean War, military fighting continued to be intense, but the limits of purely military success became increasingly visible. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The front lines were deadlocked, and human losses were growing incessantly. Under this pressure, parallel diplomatic efforts began, eventually paving the way for negotiations and a ceasefire. The first approaches to diplomatic solutions emerged as early as 1951. The United States, South Korea, North Korea, and China were under increasing international pressure to end the war. At the same time, the United Nations played a central role as a mediator and observer, as it had legitimized the conflict from the beginning. The UN called for talks to prevent an escalation into an even broader international war, especially against the backdrop of the Cold War and global tensions between the US and the Soviet Union. The negotiations began in Kaesong, North Korean-controlled, and dragged on for months. It became clear early on that the main points of contention were not only of a military nature, but above all political. The central question was the demarcation, in particular the recognition of the 38th parallel as a de facto dividing line. In addition, the return of prisoners of war and the future political structure of Korea played a decisive role. Both sides tried to secure their interests without compromising their respective allies. A striking aspect of the negotiations was the delaying tactics used by both sides. While the front lines remained largely stable, North Korea, China, and UN troops used the talks to consolidate resources, move troops, and consolidate strategic positions. This phase demonstrated the close interlocking of diplomacy and war. Military pressure and political negotiations acted reciprocally and determined the rhythm of the conflict. Despite the difficulties, progress has been made. A decisive factor was the growing degree of exhaustion on both sides. The high losses, the psychological strain on the soldiers, the economic costs, and the political instability led to a realistic understanding that a military victory was neither achievable in the short term nor in the long term. The warring parties realized that a compromise was necessary to prevent further destruction. The armistice negotiations, which were officially concluded in July 1953, eventually led to the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement. The agreement established the 38th parallel as the de facto border, established a demilitarized zone, DMZ, and regulated the return of prisoners of war. Politically, the ceasefire did not mean a final peace solution, but rather a stable stalemate that ended the active war without resolving the fundamental tensions between North and South Korea, China, and the United States. The diplomatic efforts during the Korean War show the close intertwining of military reality, political pressure, and international diplomacy. While the war had shaped Korea's physical borders, the negotiations created the institutional and legal frameworks that continue to shape the Korean Peninsula today. At the same time, it was clear that unresolved political tensions remained latent and that future conflicts could not be ruled out. To sum up, the diplomatic phase of the Korean War was just as crucial as the military operations. Without the negotiations, an end to the bloodshed would not have been possible, and the stability of the region would have been further threatened. The negotiations and the eventual ceasefire marked the transition from open war to a lasting but fragile peace order that would determine the outcome of the conflict for decades.
Chapter 18: Aftermath of the War: Political, Social, and Economic Consequences in Korea. The Korean War left a profound legacy that went far beyond military events. Politically, socially, and economically, the conflict changed the Korean Peninsula in a lasting way, shaping relations between North and South Korea, their allies, and the international community for decades. Politically, the war led to a permanent separation of the peninsula. North Korea, backed by China and the Soviet Union, consolidated an authoritarian communist regime, while South Korea, supported by the United States and other Western states, established an anti-communist government under President Syngman Rhee. This separation was not only territorial but also ideologically profound, with both states developing competing political systems, economic ideologies, and social structures. The Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, established along the 38th parallel, symbolized the physical and psychological division that continues to this day. Socially, the war had catastrophic effects on the population. Millions of people lost their lives, were wounded or abducted. Families were permanently separated, and many towns and villages lay in ruins. The traumatic experiences of the war shaped several generations, and reconstruction required decades of intensive effort. In South Korea, international aid programs, especially from the United States, led to gradual stabilization, while North Korea developed its own ways of reconstruction under severely limited resources, often relying on forced labor and military mobilization.
Economically, the war was devastating. Infrastructure, agriculture, and industry were largely in ruins. In South Korea, this led to a phase of poverty, food shortages, and massive refugee movements, while North Korea tried to secure the basic needs of the population through a centralized, planned economy and state-controlled production. It was only in the decades after the war that South Korea began a rapid economic boom, which later became known as the Han River economic miracle, while North Korea suffered from economic stagnation and isolation for a long time. The war also had a profound impact on the international power structure. The active role of the U.S. underscored the Cold War's global strategy of containing communism, while China and the Soviet Union's support for North Korea exacerbated global tensions. The Korean Peninsula became a symbol of the global ideological conflict between East and West. At the same time, the war showed the limits of military power and the need for diplomatic solutions, as the protracted negotiations on the armistice made clear. Culturally and psychologically, the war left a deep impression. The memory of the horrors of war, the willingness to sacrifice, and the suffering of the civilian population were processed in literature, film, and music. In both parts of Korea, a narrative memory emerged that reflected nationalist feelings, ideological loyalty, and the pain of separation. This collective memory continues to influence political decisions, social discourses, and the relationship between North and South Korea to this day. In summary, the Korean War was not just a military conflict, but a complex event that profoundly changed political systems, social structures, economic development, and international relations. The division of the peninsula, the traumatic experiences of the population, and the long-term political tensions are direct consequences of the war that are still felt today. Conflict teaches how war can bring about far-reaching and lasting change in every dimension of a society, far beyond the immediate battlefields.
Chapter 19: Military Lessons and Strategic Developments. What the World Learned from the War. The Korean War offered the world not only an example of the brutality of a modern conflict, but also a wealth of military lessons that influenced future wars and strategic planning. The Korean experience changed tactics, operational doctrines, technology use, and the way states responded to regional conflicts. One of the central military findings was the importance of modern air forces and precision fire. The war showed that air superiority can be crucial for stabilizing front lines, destroying supply routes, and limiting enemy movements. Coordination between the Air Force, artillery, and ground forces was tested for the first time on this scale, which laid the foundation for modern combined operations. At the same time, it became clear that airstrikes alone cannot win the war, as long as the enemy has adaptability, knowledge of the terrain, and motivation. The experience in the terrain of Korea, with mountains, rivers, and extreme weather conditions, showed that geography has a significant influence on warfare. Troop movements had to be flexible, supply lines had to be adjusted, and improvised defenses were crucial for maintaining combat effectiveness. This led to a deep understanding that terrain, climate, and logistics are at least as important as weapon strength and number of troops. Another central aspect was the role of mass mobilization and morale. By mobilizing large masses of troops and maintaining morale, China was able to offset massive losses and achieve strategic goals despite technical inferiority. This made it clear that psychological factors, motivation, and ideological loyalty can be decisive in balancing military superiority. The Korean War was also a test for new technologies. Tanks, helicopters, artillery, night vision devices, and radar were used on a larger scale for the first time. The experience showed which technologies are crucial, how they should be used, and what weaknesses they had. This resulted in targeted further developments in the following decades, which shaped modern warfare. Strategically, the war changed the understanding of limited conflicts within the framework of a global power structure. The U.S. and its allies learned that direct military victory in a regional conflict is not always possible when a global adversary is involved. This led to the development of the doctrine of limited warfare,
in which military actions are carefully weighed against political goals to avoid escalation. The war in Korea was a lesson in the fact that political and diplomatic action is just as important as military strength. Last but not least, the war offered valuable insights into coalition warfare. The cooperation of UN troops from several nations revealed both the advantages and the challenges of multinational operations. Differences in training, equipment, language, and command had to be overcome in order to carry out effective operations. These lessons were later incorporated into UN peacekeeping missions and other multinational operations. To sum up, the Korean War was a strategic and tactical lesson for the entire world. He clarified the importance of technology, logistics, morality, geographical conditions, and diplomatic matching. The lessons of their war continue to shape military doctrines, training programs, and strategic planning around the world today. And they show that modern warfare encompasses far more than mere firepower. It is an interplay of politics, technology, tactics, and humanity.
Chapter 20: Memory and Legacy: The Long-Term Significance of the Korean War. The Korean War formally ended with the armistice in 1953, but its legacy lives on to this day. The events of the conflict have had a lasting impact on the peninsula, the nations involved, and world politics. The memory of the war is not only historically significant, but also culturally, socially, and geopolitically. In Korea itself, the war still shapes the national identity today. In South Korea, the Korean War is part of the collective memory that emphasizes the resilience, suffering, and sacrifice of the population. Museums, monuments, and memorials commemorate the fallen and the brutality of the conflict. Equally important is the memory of the separation of families that was created by the DMZ. Decades later, countless families remain divided by the border, and the longing for reunification shapes social discussions and political demands. In North Korea, on the other hand, the war is portrayed as a heroic deed against imperialist aggression. State propaganda emphasizes the role of the North Korean army and China, while the destruction and human losses are less discussed. These contrasting narratives in North and South Korea illustrate how memory politics is used to support ideological and political goals. Internationally, the Korean War has permanently changed Asia's geopolitics. The U.S. established a permanent military presence in South Korea, which was part of its global strategy to contain communism. China, on the other hand, gained international weight as the successful intervention in Korea demonstrated the power of the new communist state under Mao Zedong. The war showed world powers that regional conflicts can take on international dimensions, which influenced the doctrine of deterrence and limited warfare. In addition, the Korean War left a cultural legacy. Films, literature, music, and visual arts, both in Korea and internationally, process the experiences of war. The stories of soldiers, refugees, and civilians help to deepen the understanding of human tragedies, but also of courage and solidarity. These cultural expressions serve not only to remembrance, but also to reflect on war and peace. The war has also left long-term traces at the military level. Tactics, technologies, and strategies tested during the conflict formed the basis for later military developments worldwide. The lessons learned from Korea continue to influence training, coalition operations, and the political assessment of conflicts to the present day. After all, the legacy of the Korean War remains a reminder of the dangers of unresolved political tensions. The peninsula remains divided, relations between North and South Korea remain tense, and the war serves as a stark example of how quickly regional conflicts can become embroiled in global power games. At the same time, international cooperation in ceasefire negotiations and humanitarian aid shows that diplomacy and cooperation can offer pathways to stability and peace. In summary, the Korean War is more than a military event of the past. It is a symbol of suffering, resilience, geopolitical dynamics, and the complexity of human conflicts. His memory shapes societies, ideologies, politics, and military thinking and remains an indispensable part of understanding modern world history.